G'day everyone, I'm Brett Johnson and I'm doing a little video today from vForum AU 2016, and we're going to go over disaster recovery, basically planning for failure. The premise is pretty much everything's going to fail, or we should at least expect things to fail, not build an application or build an infrastructure design to say, hey, this is reliable, it's good, but you should be building with the mindset of what's going to happen if it fails and how can we plan around that to mitigate or remove the risks. So, quick about me here. So, I'm a systems engineer for a company called Cube Networks, and part of what I've been doing over the last 8 years with various types of work is integrations, implementations, and also helping with the design. And a lot of that comes into making sure that whatever's going into it has a suitable level of redundancy to the company that's actually getting that piece of work. So a lot of my focus has been around Microsoft services, especially around Active Directory and VMware virtualization stack, including VMware View for end user compute and recently NSX. I've got a blog at sdbrett.com, and if you want to follow me, harass me, whatever, I'm at Twitter at brettjohnson008. So, first step is to define what we're going to call a disaster. A lot of people sometimes think of a disaster as what you see in a Michael Bay movie. Everything's blowing up everywhere. We've got floods, whatever it happens to be. They can be the high end, so the extreme end of the scale. Otherwise, we've got power failures. Maybe there's it could be your UPS has been incorrectly configured, so when it goes down, it takes down the power to a whole service instead of having a backup. It can be SAN failures, or even something such as a process not being followed. You're taking a node off, someone's taking a node offline, or maybe yourself. You don't follow the correct process, and that causes a major outage. And that, again, is another definition of a disaster if it has some significant impact. Now, the final one is active backhoe, i.e. someone doesn't do dial before they dig, and they put a backhoe between a nice piece of fibre. If you're running active data centers, this can have significant business impact, which is pretty much the true definition of a disaster. It is an event that causes significant business impact. It doesn't matter whether it's internal or external forces. It impacts the business significantly. It can be classed as a disaster. So, a DRP, or disaster recovery plan, is the process of planning for how you're going to act to it, but it can also have more applications because there's a lot you'll find during your discovery where you can move to other aspects of the business. You can start to understand how it works, the business processes. So you cover things such as maybe you need to do a planned maintenance. Your disaster code plans may have a lot of the basis in that of how the application can be safely brought up, verified, business owners. So these are things where they can extend the usability of a DRP. So from things such as, there's the typical, obviously, the unplanned outages, they can help with that. The process to create a DRP is very much like a project. In a sense, it is a project. It has your very typical stages. You need to see what you've got, see what you need, get the budgeting, understand priorities. So there's the very standard steps of the design, the discovery, the design, implementation, as well as course of documenting and ongoing test and review. With a DRP, it's all great, and sometimes there are places that do it. They get a plan. It's like, this is what we're going to do, and then it sits somewhere, and it sits, and people don't review it. It doesn't get tested, so that it sort of gets forgotten about. And the danger with that as well, is it's going to become out of date. The services move, people change jobs, phone numbers change. When you do an update, it will add or remove features. So if they need to be validated, those things need to be counted for in your DRP as an update. It does need to be kept up to date. As part of the discovery, my feel of it is the best way to start off with a DRP. We're assuming we're starting fresh. But a business doesn't have any disaster recovery, and unfortunately it's not always an uncommon case. So first thing to do is find all the documentation you can. We're talking your Visio diagrams, any design documents that might help you map out your infrastructure as a whole. You want to understand what your infrastructure is capable of doing as it is. Maybe what you can just add a license to get a new feature that you may require. Okay, so you want to understand your capabilities. You want to understand where the faults might be, or where a single fault is if you're running a single switch, or maybe a single switch stack, and you may be at a risk of a software update taking down the whole switch stack. So you need to understand those sorts of things. The fault domain sizing. So if you've gone from a scale up perspective, in terms of virtualization, so you might have 4 physical processors on a server. You're going to have a high amount of VM density. So if that server fails as a host, then that will have a bigger business impact. So it increases the size of your failure domain. Whereas if you go scale out and you have a lot of smaller servers, you may only run, say 20, 25 on a host, and you may be running more depending on your scale, but you spread that risk out. So a host, when it fails, it doesn't impact as much business, and then also your clusters and how you protect those clusters. So you'd be wanting to verifying that if you've got a cluster that protects more business critical applications, that has actually better protection than maybe one that runs your BAU support servers, which they go down. Okay, BAU might be a bit kneecapped for a little while. And as you go through, you want to see even things such as your WAN links. How big are they? Do you have redundancy in your WAN links as well, especially if they're critical? You want to make sure, if you can find documentation, you're updating that as you go. If you don't have it, you want to be writing this, because you are going to have to refer back to it later. And again, with this has been an ongoing process, having that documentation is going to be good, because then you just update it. You just update the little bits that have changed. It makes life a lot easier. The next part of the discovery is then we go into application. So we understand our infrastructure now. We understand what it can do, where its risks lie in the infrastructure as a whole. But most of when you've got your applications, you need to now understand, well, what does an application do? Where does its dependencies lie? What are the impacts of this application specifically? If you've got a multi-site, maybe you've got we'll go with a corporate office, and you have remote manufacturing sites. They have an application which controls the conveyor belt. You talk to somebody in BAU, you may not get a full picture of what happens if that system fails, goes offline, what it depends on. You have a couple of notes here and there is probably the realistic thing. So you want to start talking then to the site managers and say, well, what are your manual processes if this fails? What do you do? Being remote sites, there is a very good chance it's had to go down for maintenance, whether planned or unplanned, at some point. And you need to understand what that impact is. And if you do it at an application level, it helps with the planning later on what priorities there are to protect. If there's a manual workload, maybe the investment in protecting that is not as much. However, if there isn't and it causes a site outage, you send 50 people home, you can't do the process, you've got to catch up for the next few days, it can have a big impact to the business. And what we're trying to do is build a mental image of, and Visio at the time, or actually even just pen, paper, just start drawing, where does this application talk? We need to understand this, because we need to understand what it depends on. And one of the big important things where it depends is, this application here is really well protected, but it relies on a database over here, and that database isn't well protected, then it can take out the application. So we need to then make sure that that database or that database server has good protection. And if it's required to come up before the application, it's part of how we would plan our bringing everything back online if required. And also verification, because then for that application we need to verify the database. Those dependencies are very important. So once we understand what the infrastructure does and we understand what the applications are, where the dependencies lie, we need to be able to map those. So we need to know where the database sits, so physically where it sits, or more importantly, where it's capable of sitting in our world of policy-based storage and vMotion DRS. there's a likelihood we don't say, it sits on ESX host 23, it's going to sit on SQL cluster 04, whatever it happens to be. So we need to understand where that range is. So when that cluster goes down or something goes in that cluster, we need to understand that. We need to understand that protection level. We may find that we have a mix of critical and non-critical applications on the same cluster, or databases if we stick with that example. And the licensing cost to protect those, because we have to do them all at once, could be cost prohibitive compared to having splitting them off into their clusters and redesigning the logical clustering here. We also want to understand any limitations. Some applications may have application level redundancy that we can build, that we can put. We may be able to put in another web front end, or we, again, stick on databases, SQL, active-active, active-passive. We need to understand what it allows, and also sometimes we have availability options that an application simply doesn't handle, and we need to understand this. So when we combine our first two discoveries, we can start to bring these together, and from here we can do the risk and impact analysis or assessment. So we know where our fail points are, we know where our dependencies are, and we can present to the business and say, these applications have this risk. This is, if they're down, this is the impact, and this server is depended on by another 3, so that raises it's a bit more critical. And putting all that together, the business should be able to then come back to you and say, okay, this is the cost of outage. I personally don't do the cost analysis. I can say the impact analysis, but the costing, I believe, is something that's more business aligned. And they can say, okay, this is the business, this is what it's going to cost, and we can even put in our impact and risk and assessment. We can say there are some simple mitigations. A cluster doesn't have HA turned on, it's a misconfiguration. It's a simple one to turn on, or we can increase the WAN link because if we have to do any replication, we can put those in there as well for things that are going to affect multiple applications. But ideally, what we're looking for from here is, one, to educate the business on where their risks lie, provide them the information they need to say, well, this is the cost of the risk, and justify and prioritize the applications that are going to be protected. So that will help us understand protection tiering, just like storage tiering for performance and availability. We're doing the same thing, except it's at an application level. So things that have domain controllers are an example. They're very critical. However, they don't always need to be on. They don't really need to be on a highly available, fault-tolerant system, because they've got a lot of application redundancy. We can put one maybe at a dark or at a DR center, whether it's a dark DR center or a hot DR center. You could have a couple there. They're lightweight. They sit there. They replicate by themselves. So it helps provide that education and makes informed decisions of where the money should be invested. There's no other way around it. To have protection costs money. The better the protection. You want 5 nines, great, that's 7 figures. You want 4 nines, that's higher 6s. Arbitrary numbers here, but the availability you require depends on that you can get depends on your investment. So with costing, there's a few different ways to calculate the costs. There's the immediate financial cost. That's production stopped. Production generates us 100K an hour. That's an immediate cost, it's down. A ongoing financial cost is, okay, and it's going to take us 3 hours. We're about 30% down over those 3 hours to recover. That's another 30 grand an hour. So if it goes down for an hour, that's about 400 grand. So there's 2 different ways to estimate those immediate financial costs. Other ones are the reputational cost. So a very good example of this might be a store front end. I have a web front end. This is where people come to buy. I have a immediate cost of an outage if that goes down because people can't purchase. Well, that's it. They can't purchase. I'm not getting their revenue stream. Hopefully they'll come back. But if it's down or in a heavily degraded state due to an outage, they may look and go, this store sucks. I'm not going to buy this. And therefore, they're not even going to come back. They may not do an additional purchase because they haven't had a good experience. So that's a reputational cost which can impact the ongoing. And the other thing that reputational cost comes into it is someone has a bad reputation. The statistic is they tell 7 people. Yeah, these are hard to estimate numbers, but they are there. So once this is done, then you should be able to get the business should be able to say, okay, it's going to cost this much. These are our priorities. This is where we think we can get the best bang for our buck. We can protect ourselves the best. And then we go back into design. So we've done it, this is almost a 2-project phase. We've done a whole project around discovery and priority and scoping. And now we go into the design and implementation phase. So we start looking more deeply into the application specific, because if we've got 70 applications, it's going to take a very long time to say this application's capabilities are this, and talk to all the application vendors and find out the true nature, where business might come back and say, there's these 10 are your priority, this is what we budgeted this financial year. You can get a deeper look, a better look. We can then align our infrastructure to how that's going to help, and we may put a bit of headroom on that for other things that are coming down the pipe. Some of the things you put in infrastructure may help other parts. We need to then also build the procedures. So there's no point in saying, yes, we've protected everything. There's no procedure on, it's gone down. What do I do? Well, I don't know. Hope it comes back up and hope it's good. So we need procedures then on who to contact, who are the business owners. We need to verify that when it's up, it is actually up. And we need to document those. We need to document them very thoroughly. We bring those into a project. You know, how the project works could be a global overarching risk mitigation, whatever it happens to be, project. It could be per application. If you've got a big ERP that's, if you're everything you've got in your country, then that in itself to protect may be a project, or the implementation of this may be so significant it's going to be in a project and it won't protect everything that's in your first 12 months of priority. And then we have the fun of going to CAB. I'm sure we all love CAB. And then we document again. We make sure it's up to date. We get someone else to check it. After we've got documentation, we need to test. So we've built up applications. We need either maintenance windows, and definitely at the start maintenance windows, because you want to be sure that what you've done and what you've put in is actually right. You don't want to say, yep, it's great, I've put in everything else, turned it on, performance is down because you've got a bad WAN link you've overlooked, and that's all you've got going forward. You need to validate it before you can say, hey, look, we've completed. You need to verify. You need to simulate in some way a failure. You can safely you may be able to safely simulate turning one server off and letting its passive partner in a HA partnership come back, like kick over. You may have other things where you just, that's really depends. It's sort of a big depends one there. So you want to validate and test, and then you want to document again your validation and testing. You need to make sure that your testing caters for these scenarios. Your documentation needs to say, this scenario, this is the plan, this is the validation for this plan. And these things, especially the validation part of this, can then be used for upgrades. So if we have to do a major upgrade, we go from version 5 to 6, or whatever it happens to be. We can use this to say, okay, so this is how it's expected to act. This is the results we're expecting. So this helps provide more value out of a DRP, and a little bit get around the, well, what if it doesn't fail? Well, we've spent X amount for nothing. Well, it probably will fail at some point. But it just gives that little bit of extra value, and it needs to be reviewed and ongoingly reviewed. So new releases, have you put in new features? Has someone left? Okay, so we need to put that in. We need to make sure our contacts are up to date. Our vendor contacts, especially if we've got a single point to get to in the vendor. Has our TAM changed? Well, we really want to make sure that, because if we have it depends on the significance of the failure, we may need to get them on board at 2 a.m. So we want to make sure that everything is up to date and it goes out of date very fast. So basically, the moral of the story is plan it, document it, and verify the ever-living hell out of it and document it again. So thank you for watching. I'm Brett Johnson, and yeah, I'll see you next time.